Good morning. Welcome back as we continue to move our way through this extraordinary Mimer, Who Will Nurture My Faith? Today's class is generously sponsored, or I should say this segment of the class, to the elevation of the neshama of Rachel Bas Shlomo. May her neshama have an aliyah, and may the Torah we study together serve to bring her nachas on high. We learned about the pasuk, about the verse V'atah Tetzaveh. It's a verse in which Moshe Rabbeinu is informed that he has a sacred duty of instructing the Jewish people about bringing olive oil so that the menorah can be kindled. There were a number of seeming anomalies in that verse. We explored them together. A Chassidic or mystical interpretation was introduced. It turns out that Moshe Rabbeinu is not only the messenger who brings news of God's command to the Jewish people, but in fact, this verse addresses a deeper, a more profound essence of the mission and mandate that God tasks Moshe Rabbeinu with, namely, Tetzaveh in the term of not only command, but also connect. Moshe is the nexus. He has the privilege, the wherewithal and unique ability to connect Am Yisrael, finite, small little creatures like you and I, with Oyer Ein Sof, with the infinite Creator. We talked about the symbiotism in that relationship. Moshe Rabbeinu not only is making a contribution towards our welfare, but in fact, Moshe Rabbeinu is also enriched in the process. Where V'yikro Elecha, we bring him the oil, symbolic of spiritual light. Part 2 of the Mimer now begins to explore and explain this in greater detail. Magdim Baha Mimer, the Rebbe says, in order to understand this, now going back to the previous Rebbe's Mimer, which is elaborated on in this Chassidic Discourse, the Friedrich Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, introduces in that Mimer this notion that Moshe Rabbeinu is nikra, is called or referred to by our sages, specifically in the Zohar, as Raya Mehemna, the faithful shepherd. Raya is Aramaic for shepherd. Mehemna is the word in Aramaic used for emunah, or faith. The Shnei Pirushim Bazeh. There are actually two ways to understand this notion of Moshe Rabbeinu's special description. I want to point out that when we talk about Moshe Rabbeinu, there are many facets of this most extraordinary human being. In the Rambam's words, the most perfect specimen of humanity ever to walk the face of earth. Moshe Rabbeinu is a goel. Moshe Rabbeinu is a redeemer. He is the one who leads the Jewish people out of Egyptian exile. Moshe Rabbeinu is the one through whom the Jewish people received the Torah. As we talked about yesterday, Torah Tziva Lanu. Moshe Rabbeinu was tasked by God to be the messenger. He brought us the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest of prophets. In fact, even Mashiach, Maimonides tells us, who will be an amazing prophet, and he will teach Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu and to the patriarchs. Nonetheless, when it comes to prophecy, Moshe Rabbeinu's will always remain supreme. A Navi, a Rebbe, a Goel. He has many, many facets, Moshe. Here we focus on the epithet that the Zohar applies to him, almost indicating that this is perhaps the most profound function of Moshe Rabbeinu. Not just being the lawgiver, or one to bring us the messages of what the actual mitzvahs or their rules are, not just being the one to lead us into our national birth that took place on Pesach, and not just being the greatest of prophets, but specifically Moshe Rabbeinu's essence is encapsulated within this formula, shepherd of faith. And shepherd of faith, as we're going to see, is the secondary, or perhaps the subtext of the faithful shepherd. It's interesting to note that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he receives the orders by Hashem to assume that mantle that is so unique, he first was a shepherd. That was after Moshe Rabbeinu doing many things, including being a chief of staff in the most powerful office of the world at the time, including, after having to flee Egypt, becoming a conscripted member of the Eritrean armed forces, rising through its ranks and becoming the supreme commander, and eventually the actual monarch of that country. And then, immediately before Moshe Rabbeinu becomes the Moshe Rabbeinu we are familiar with, he was a shepherd. And he pursued a single solitary lost sheep for 3 days until he was able to provide for it, until he could bring it back to the flock. And the Medrash tells us that Hashem said, that is the sign of my leader. This is the person who will be there to nurture the Jewish people and to bring them into peoplehood. So when the Zohar calls Moshe Rabbeinu a faithful shepherd, it has a very literal ring to it. And yet, the Mimer emphasizes that there are Beis Pirushim, two interpretations. He is the Roya Neman, he is indeed the faithful shepherd, who not only takes his leadership responsibility extremely seriously, but also takes every single member of Am Yisrael seriously. The leadership of Moshe Rabbeinu is not only a national mandate, it's a personal mandate, worrying about each and every single member of the nation. In addition to this, Moshe Rabbeinu is also a shepherd of faith. Ushehu zon umefarnes es Yisrael. He sustains or nourishes Israel be'inyan ha'emunah, with regard to faith. Now, of course, what does that mean? Don't we all have faith innately? Before we go further, just a word about faith. People say, seeing is believing. I think that's ridiculous. Why should seeing be believing? Seeing is seeing. Hearing is hearing. Tasting is tasting. Smelling is smelling. Understanding is understanding. And feeling is, well, feeling. In other words, these are all different phenomena through which we relate to things outside of us. We all feel our own existence. We know of our own existence. We're capable of seeing things around us. We see with our eyes, we hear with our ears, we taste with our tongue, we smell with our nose. Different faculties, different abilities. They're not to be confused. How does the soul relate? How does the soul relate to God, for example? The soul doesn't have a corporeal existence. It doesn't have a body. It doesn't taste or smell. It doesn't see or hear in a physical sense. How does the soul relate? The answer? The soul relates to God with emunah. And the soul, as it's invested in our bodies, relates to the divinity we can't see, hear, touch, taste, or perhaps even feel. We experience that through the medium of what is called faith. The symptoms of faith could be feeling. The symptoms of faith could be clarity, as if we're seeing. The symptom of faith could be a sense of security and surety. But ultimately, faith is the language the neshama speaks. The faith that we are all naturally endowed with by virtue of the fact that we have a neshama. If we have a soul, we have to have faith, because that's the way the soul communicates. That's, if you will, how the soul exists. So the notion that each and every one of us has faith by virtue of the fact that we have a neshama, which is a piece of God, is, talked about by our sages. It's framed in perhaps simple terminology. Yisrael he'ma'aminim b'nei ma'aminim. It's a statement that's made in the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat on page 97. On a literal level, it sounds like we are people who received faith from our parents. Our parents heard from their parents, or heard from the previous generation, going all the way back to the exodus from Mitzrayim and to a nation that stood around the foot of Mount Sinai. In some way, all of us were present. That affects our subconsciousness. It affects the structure of our souls and how our souls live and breathe. But ultimately, this is something that was received directly from our parents. On a literal level, we heard it from them, they heard it from the previous generation, and there's an unbroken chain of transmission for the mass revelation of Mount Sinai. No faith as Maimonides illustrates, claims mass revelation. There are many faith systems. The faith system will be based upon the experience of a person or a small number of his acolytes and followers. But to be sure, as P.T. Barnum said, you can fool some of the people all the time and all the people some of the time. But you can't fool all the people all the time. It would be impossible to convince millions and millions of people that they all saw the same thing. And then to have the next generation question and ask their elders, did you really see that? Did you really hear that? Somehow, it's persistently remained with our people. From Jews living in Asia to Africa, from Europe to the far reaches of distant islands, Jewish people have always had the same tradition. They had to get it from somewhere. The statistical possibility of creating a scenario that involved millions of people having an experience is simply impossible. So there's a certain element, if you will, of proof. We can be sure or certain that this faith we received from our parents, who received it from their parents, even if some of you perhaps didn't receive it from your parents or even grandparents, but you know that at some point your ancestors received it from their predecessors. And Am Yisrael has received a continuous tradition. On some level, that's the meaning of Ma'aminim b'nei Ma'aminim. On a deeper level, though, the notion of faith is something that's transmitted. It's not even something that's taught, but rather it's caught from our parents, from our earliest experiences. And the faith passed on from generation to generation continues to flourish within the hearts, minds, and souls of the Jewish people. Yet, the problem with faith is that it can often remain atmospheric, not actually impacting or saturating or permeating our everyday reality. As the Mimer says, Efsher, there is the possibility, Shatiyah bebechinas makif, that the faith we experience is experienced at arm's length, at bay. The simple example, of course, is the fact that, as the Gemara tells us, you could have a thief, a ganva. He's a pum machtarta. He's at the threshold of his heist. He's going to be risking his very life to steal somebody else's money. What's he doing? You know, they say there's no atheists in the foxholes. This is his own little foxhole, if you will. If he gets caught, he'll have to use his weapon. What's he doing? Invariably, if he's Jewish, he's praying. That makes no sense. It really makes no sense, because if you believe in God, and clearly he does because he's praying, then you must believe that God is Zanu Mefarnes, that God sustains all living flesh. Surely God can sustain you as well without you having to resort to breaking the law and doing something immoral. And yet, the faith that you have that impels you to pray or to believe that God can save you, in some way, in your mind, in this dissonance, is being squared with a reality that is antithetical to what God actually wants. But this is the nature of faith. Yes, I believe it's out there, but it doesn't actually permeate the way I'm living, if you will, in here, in my heart, in my actual mind, and in my behavior. So the meaning of Moshe Rabbeinu being a shepherd of faith, just as a shepherd provides water, hydration, provides grass or hay, whatever it is, the fodder that's needed for the sheep. Similarly, when we talk about a shepherd of faith, Moshe Rabbeinu is providing our souls with that hydration. He's giving us that sustenance. It doesn't mean that Moshe Rabbeinu gives us faith. We all have it. It means he nurtures the faith. He brings it forth. Let me give you a simple example. You might have somebody who is born with talent, maybe musical talent, maybe poetic talent, maybe athletic talent. At some point in their lives, these people may experience a number of different events that cause them, A, to realize they have this talent, and B, to stimulate their drive or desire to develop it. Almost every successful person who has actualized the latent potential that he or she was born with can point to at least one person who inspired them, who mentored them, who coached them, who helped them to nurture and bring forth this remarkable talent that they always had. And had that person not been there for them, the question would have been, who would have nurtured that natural ability? Would it ever have been revealed? Perhaps not. So in the same way that a parent, a teacher, an avuncular individual who for whatever reason took an interest in us and helped us develop that talent, it doesn't mean they gave us the talent, but you're ever so grateful that they helped you develop it. Usually these are people who believe in our potential more than we believe in ourselves. These are people who live by example. And these are people who have a unique talent of being able to stimulate and inspire us. That, my dear friends, is Moshe Rabbeinu. The talent or natural ability is our faith, our profound and unbreakable connection with Hashem. But it's Moshe Rabbeinu who helps us to actualize, to nurture, and to develop it in the fullest sense. So this that Moshe Rabbeinu proverbially sustains, provides for, or enables the emunah to flourish, in the language of Chassidus, he brings it forth from its latent state in a manner that profoundly and personally transforms us. In the previous Rebbe's Mimer that the Rebbe is elaborating on, he continues to explain that this notion of Moshe Rabbeinu being the faithful shepherd, which in actuality is the shepherd of faith, the intention here is not only about the historic Moshe Rabbeinu, but gam le'ispashtusa de Moshe shebechol dor v'dor. It refers also to this extension of Moshe, which is found generationally. In simple words, there are some things about Moshe Rabbeinu that are unique to Moshe, the son of Amram. Moshe, the son of Amram, was the one who took us out of Mitzrayim. No Jewish leader later on in history took us out of Mitzrayim. There were other people who had the term of Goel, Redeemer. Mashiach will be the greatest Redeemer, but he still won't be taking us out of the Egyptian exile. That's something that the historical Moshe did. There will be no future Jewish leader, nor has there been anybody in the past who received Hashem's prophecy and got mitzvahs, permanent mitzvahs from Hashem. There are 613 mitzvahs. There will never be a 614th, and never will that number fall to 612. All 613 mitzvahs are elaborated in the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash, called in the world the Pentateuch. The later prophets merely came to emphasize, to accentuate, and to urge Am Yisrael to follow Torah Moshe. As the last of the great prophets, Malachi said, Zichru Torat Moshe Avdi. Remember the Torah of Moshe, my servant. That, of course, is specific to the historical Moshe. But the Zohar talks about Moshe Rabbeinu not only as an individual, but rather also as an institution, a concept, an ideal that has various manifestations over the ages during the course of Jewish history. The Zohar says Ispashtusa, the extension of Moshe Rabbeinu, which at times means an actual reincarnation of Moshe. For example, Hillel is said to be a reincarnation of Moshe. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was said to share the soul of Moshe. The prophet Yonah was said to be an extension of the soul of Moshe, as were many others. But here we don't refer to the notion of Gilgul or reincarnation per se, which is a subject for another day. Here we're referring to this ideal that Moshe Rabbeinu represents a persistent reality within Jewish life. Think of it as a line. Mathematically speaking, every line is comprised of individual dots. So the historic Moshe Rabbeinu is the beginning of that line. He's the first Rebbe. But that line is something that has woven its way throughout the tapestry or strata of Jewish history. Ispashtusa de Moshe, says the Zohar, an extension of Moshe is to be found b'chol dora v'dora, in every generation. The question for us is, when we speak of Moshe Rabbeinu in the generational sense, which essence or element of Moshe is it referring to? Is it referring to the notion of the greatest prophet? Certainly not. That's unique to the historic Moshe. Is it referring to Redeemer from exile or exilic circumstances in Egypt? Certainly not. It refers to the historic Moshe. The idea of being the Torah, the one to receive the Torah, Torah Tzivah lanu Moshe, does not refer to the generational concept or institution of Moshe Rabbeinu. The Frierdiker Rebbe is introducing us to a fascinating concept. He's teaching us that the ideal of Raya Mehemna, the faithful shepherd and the shepherd of faith, is actually endemic to every Moshe, or every extension of that unique spiritual line. That is to say, in every generation, when we merit a Moshe Rabbeinu, we will find a person who ministers or cares and is concerned and sustains not only his own yeshiva or his own disciples or the Jews who look like him or buy into his ideology or theology, but rather the Moshe Rabbeinu will be a person who cares about every single member of Am Yisrael, including the ones who serve as his detractors. Moshe Rabbeinu had detractors. We just read all about that in Parshas Korach. He had many challenges, and yet Moshe Rabbeinu was ever concerned with each and every member of Am Yisrael. He was a faithful shepherd. So is the generational Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu was a shepherd of faith, sustaining and nurturing the intrinsic essence of our faith. So is the generational Moshe. The Roshei Alfei Yisrael, that the proverbial notion of the heads of the thousands of Israel, a scriptural expression for Jewish or Torah leadership, Shebachol Dor, in every generation, Heim Mechazkim Es Ha'emunah de Yisrael. They fortify faith, they nurture our faith in every generation. Shebedoram. Now the emphasis here is, there is something about the first and the greatest Moshe Rabbeinu, the historic Moshe Rabbeinu, whose soul continues to function. Moshe Rabbeinu is alive and well, right here in this world, although not in a terrestrial sense. Yet, Moshe Rabbeinu's spirit resonates terrestrially within each and every one of us. And there is a little Moshe inside you and me. That little Moshe sustains our faith. There's a part of us, a part of our soul, that's linked to the original Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama. That Moshe Rabbeinu nurtures the faith of all the Jewish people in all generations. In fact, there are Shiva Royim, there are 7 shepherds within the literature of mystical teachings of Torah and Midrashic teachings. And those Shiva Royim impact us. Avraham Avinu, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, Aaron, Yosef, you know them. That's the idea of the Ushpizin. They visit us in the Sukkah for 7 days, each day led by another one of those Roim, those shepherds. Each one of those shepherds actually contributes something in the grand scheme of the proverbial body of the Jewish people. So there's this notion of Moshe Rabbeinu who nurtures the faith of every Jew in every generation. That's the structure Hashem built. And then there's this idea that in each unique generation that has its own Moshe Rabbeinu, that the faith of that generation will be nurtured by its Moshe Rabbeinu. That's why the Rebbe adds in the parenthesis, Shebedoram, Shaha'amuna Shalahem. There's the function of Moshe Rabbeinu, But that also, on some level, is atmospheric. And then there's the individual generational Moshe Rabbeinu, who is ensuring that everybody's faith becomes poignantly and profoundly revealed in a very personal way. To illustrate this, the Frierdiker Rebbe reached for a historic example. Ukamoi, for example, Mordechai. You heard of him. That's the famous Mordechai who leads the Jewish people during the time or period we call Purim. We know that Mordechai was an actual extension of Moshe Rabbeinu in his generation. We know this because Mimer Azal. There's an actual statement from our sages, which is found in the Medrash Rabbah on Megillas Esther, that says, and this is the quote, Mordechai bedoro ki Moshe bedoro. It says clearly that Mordechai was like Moshe in his generation. Shagam bizman gzeirus Haman, that also during the time of the decree, a very, very difficult and painful time to be a Jew, a time when every Jew walked around for a year with a target on his back, being mocked by the locals, that you'll soon be in a common grave, that all of you are going to be massacred, that Jewish lives don't matter. Shalim V'atah Tetzaveh, that the study of Torah, the kiyum ha-mitzvahs oz, and the fulfillment of mitzvahs at that time, hayakashur imesiras nefesh, required great personal sacrifice. It wasn't easy to do these things, because if you were visibly Jewish, you would be persecuted for it. If you identified publicly as a Jew, if you remained fast and tenaciously held to the traditions, to the teachings of Torah, to its doctrines and its instructions, you were putting yourself in harm's way, in a very real way. And yet, Mordechai galvanizes the nation, inspires them to live with sacrifice, to refuse to shrink before danger, and Mordechai was uniquely positioned at the time to inspire the people to exhibit an outward display of Jewish pride. He actually made these prayer rallies. He gathered Jewish people in a very public way. And he did so to strengthen the faith that resides at the core of every single Yid's neshama of his generation. The Amunah of Yisrael b'Havaya, the La'amoid Chazak, not only that they should have a sense of faith, they should be proud to be Jewish, which is important, but that should translate into a steadfast commitment and devotion, Belimud HaTorah, in the study of Torah, the Kiyum HaMitzvahs, and the fulfillment of mitzvahs. So Mordechai actually makes a difference in the lives of the Jewish people of his generation. He inspires his generation. He uplifts his generation. He enables his generation to reach deep inside and to find that reservoir of faith and allow it to rise and express itself. And Mordechai, who's like Moshe Rabbeinu in his generation, nurtures and fortifies the faith under the fire of the time. It's very important to point out that the notion of the Jewish people's devotion at the time could not be counted on or taken for granted. Contrary to what many people think, equating Haman and his decree with Hitler, Yamach Shemo, Hitler went after you whether you were identifying Jewishly or not. But in fact, the real Haman is Stalin, who murdered millions of Jews. Stalin's goal was to wipe out Jewishness. If you would renounce your Jewishness, if you wouldn't identify as a Jew, and if you wouldn't practice Jewishly, they'd leave you alone. The Jewish people, as we'll see later in this Mimer, the Alter Rebbe taught in the time of Purim, were going to be facing genocide only if they identified Jewishly. And yet nobody broke ranks. Nobody went into hiding. Nobody removed their outward expression of their Judaism. Quite on the contrary, V'rabbi misyadim, we read of a time when there is a flowering of Jewish pride and observance amidst the ranks of those who had previously become assimilated and fallen away from Yiddishkeit. And that was due to Mordechai. That doesn't happen by itself. And so it is that the Ispashtusa, the extension of Moshe Rabbeinu, in every generation is uniquely suited to fortify his own generation. The Rebbe goes on to say, after the Friedrich Rebbe explains in great detail, that Moshe and his proverbial extension in every generation fortify and strengthen the faith of Yisrael. Mevayer, he explains, diuk loshen hakasuv, the precise nature or syntax of that biblical verse that we started this Mimer with. The notion of shemen, we talked about olive oil, and then, as you might remember from the previous episode, we talked about kosis, crushed, lamoir, for the purpose of illumination. And the emphasis here being on lamaor, source of illumination, velo lahoyer, not in order to illuminate. Source of illumination refers to the actual source from which the effulgence or rays emerge. The crushing identifies or focuses on the source, not the expression. And that's unique, shebizman hagolus, to the time of exilic suffering and persecution. Because it refers, proverbially, besides or in addition to its literal meaning of actually crushing olives, it refers to Am Yisrael. And it talks about this idea, shekol, in a time of galus, in a time of exilic persecution, shekol echad v'echad, that each and every one feels a sense of despair. They feel crushed, they feel demoralized, they feel harmed, they feel squeezed, endangered. They have anxiety. It's a difficult time. So they feel this nishbar, they're broken, they're nidke, they're crushed, they're kosis. So in a time of being broken, in a time when you feel yourself pulverized, al yedei zeh, by virtue of those difficult circumstances, magiyim lamoir, in other words, by dint of difficulty, we reach or are able to lay bare the mo'ir, not the outer radiance, but the inner source of that radiance, as if to say the source of the spiritual light itself. Shemimenu ha'etzem, the essence, shemimenu nimtza ha'er, from which the light of the neshama radiates outwards. In other words, in this Mimer, the Friedrich Rebbe identifies two reasons, if you will, that the Jewish people were very, very strong in their faith at that time. One is the efforts of Mordechai. The other is the response to the circumstances. The Rebbe points out a seeming challenge here in understanding this thesis. V'tzarech lahavan, that has to be understood. Hashaychus, the connection, the hapirush bekosis lamoir, the interpretation on kosis, being crushed, that enables us to reach so deep into ourselves that our heroic essence is revealed. Lahamavur b'hamaymer lifnizet, what's explained in the very same Mimer earlier, shemoshe v'ispashtusa dilesha b'chol dar, that it's Moshe and the proverbial extension of Moshe in every generation, who was zonu mefarnes ha'emunah, who nourishes and nurtures and curates that faith, shetiyah b'pnimius, that we should experience it in a personal way. In other words, how or why is it that during the period of Purim, we, the Jewish people, stood strong and proud, expressing our faith in an unflinching fashion? What was the cause? One could argue it was Mordechai. It pretty much says that in numerous sources. One could argue it was a response to the circumstances. You know, as they say, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. All of heroism is born out of challenging circumstances. Very few, or really if ever, have great leaders been born with silver spoons in their mouth. The path of least resistance usually leads to least achievement. The greatest of resistance will force the protagonist in that situation, to work really hard to overcome those challenges, invariably revealing inner strength or heroism that the person might not have known they even possessed. How did the Jewish people so heroically defy the authorities at the time? How did they so proudly express their Jewishness? Prior to the decree, they had assimilated. They went to a party on the Holy Shabbat. They ate food, gorged themselves on non-kosher food served on utensils from the Beit HaMikdash. It's like mind-boggling. It's like in our day and age, taking a Sefer Torah and playing football with it. It was demeaning, it was a disgrace. And they did so, cold-bloodedly, even laughing and enjoying it. And the same Jew, after having been told that he is going to be murdered along with all the members of his family, suddenly is fiercely and proudly Jewish. What made that happen? Well, the answer is the anti-Semitism, the hatred that they experienced was a real wake-up call. They got this cold water dashed in their face, and they said, one second, so we're really not like everybody else. And it made them all of a sudden feel the importance of their own Jewishness. On some level, these two explanations do not seem to be symbiotic or even kindred. They seem to be two mutually exclusive ideas. It was either the leadership of Mordechai or it was the circumstances. And it's not to say they couldn't be both, but if one was to illustrate what was it that enabled the Jewish people to be who they became, to experience the miracles of Purim, you kind of have to either choose one path or the other. And here, the Frierdiker Rebbe seems to be talking about both simultaneously. But really, they're mutually exclusive. One is dependent on the spiritual charisma of the Moshe Rabbeinu of the generation. The other is on the harsh and punishing circumstances. So the Rebbe is now going to set out to explain how these two detailed explanations, which are very different, are actually not exclusive, but rather interdependent and ultimately mutually complementary. These two ideas, in fact, operate in a perfect parallel, in a perfect synchronicity. Join me for part 3 soon as we begin to explore how both of these different ideals are actually traveling the same path and ultimately are one and the same. See you back soon.